Good morning, everybody. I am Rob Bennett, CEO, founder of Eco Districts, and really pleased to be joined by Professor Kofi Boone today on a presentation he's calling Notes on Resilience and Resistance. I'm really pleased to have Professor Boone with us. He was our keynote speaker at our conference in Pittsburgh in the fall, and happy to have him back to share his thoughts on his work and scholarship, and in the context of the world that we're living in 2020. We have been doing this webinar series for a couple of years, and this year we're really zeroing in on the sort of issues that are most present in our world today, that the intersectionality of race, the intersectionality of climate impacts, and the COVID health crisis, and how these issues are playing out in urban planning or in urban and small town development. And Professor Boone is uniquely positioned. His scholarship and his work in communities has been really intersectional on all these issues. So really pleased to have him join us. For those who are new to our series, there's a couple pieces of housekeeping. Remember to keep your sound on mute. There is a Q&A function. We're new to using Zoom. We've been using WebEx for some time, but there is a Q&A function. Please, if you've got questions, please start to put those questions together during his talk. I will then take a look and consolidate, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the last 15 minutes or so of the presentation. So really happy to have as much dialogue as we can on this webinar with Kofi. So Kofi is a professor of landscape architecture at North Carolina State University in the College of Design, and his work has been focusing on the changing nature of communities and developing tools for enhanced community engagement and design. Throughout his scholarship and teaching and extension service, his work is in the overlap between landscape architecture and environmental justice, with specializations in democratic design and digital media and interpreting cultural landscapes. His teaching and professional work has earned him numerous awards, including student and professional ASLA awards, including, and very importantly, that he's been both the Department of Landscape Architecture Professor of the Year and the Alumni Association Outstanding Teacher. So not only is his work important and really inspirational, but his work with students has obviously gone noticed, and that's an incredible accolade for Kofi. He is a frequent speaker at national conferences, including our summit last year, as I mentioned, and his published work is broadly disseminated in many peer review and popular media, including the Landscape Architecture magazine. And in addition to his studies and his teaching, he serves on the board of directors of the Corp Network, as well as the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where he's the vice president of education. He's a proud, born and raised native of Detroit, and he received his master in landscape architecture at the University of Michigan. So without further ado, let me welcome Kofi Boone.
All right, well, thank you, Rob, for the really gracious introduction. Always good to hear Detroit said out of other people's mouths. Still, even though I live in North Carolina, that's still where my heart is, but I'm really glad to be with you all today. With your permission, I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to need permission to share the screen. I'm sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I can stop sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, see if that works.
Works out great. Thank you. And once again, thank you, everybody. Notes on Resilience and Resistance. It's great to be with you all today. This work is reflective in no small part influenced by the great work at Eco Districts and the great opportunity I had to be with Rob and with many others in Pittsburgh, which is doing amazing work and it really needs more attention. But this picture indicates sort of our regional landscape and some of the issues that we face. We'll come back to it, but these young ladies are looking out at the Tar River in the town of Princeville, and we'll get to why they're looking out in that direction soon. Do want to start with some acknowledgements, including land acknowledgements and acknowledging Indigenous people. I'm coming from North Carolina, which before was the land of the Eno and the Saponi and the Shakori and many other Indigenous groups, and asking permission to share these words on land that, although they did not own, was influential to their cultural understanding. And also asking permission for those who are dealing with a number of challenges right now, the ongoing challenges with COVID that have gripped our entire country and really the world, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and still people protesting in the streets 100 days later, and also real-time issues. I know where Rob is right now, the West Coast is burning, and it's a major, major issue, as well as hurricanes expected to come, Hurricane Sally to the southeast. So we're really in the middle of a dynamic period, and it's important to talk about some of the intersections of some of these issues now. This is a statement that was used in the marketing for this piece, but the point I wanted to call your attention to is towards the end is, what does this mean for our professions, this time of dramatic change, and really pointing a lens at our professional expertise and facility with the technical, non-human aspects of issues of sustainability and resilience, and the need to continue to build our skill sets with the social, cultural, and economic aspects of it. So this talk will talk about that topic from multiple perspectives. And our hope is when we get through it, we will share examples of the need for multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. This is beyond the scope of any individual profession. The need to focus on sustaining long-term resilience and sustainability efforts. Some of the cards are stacked against us, so to speak, but that's an area where we need to push, and really how to continue to work collaboratively with the communities that we serve and that we belong to. So those are hopefully 3 takeaways from this talk. There are many quotes describing resilience. This one is interesting, comes from a couple of architects, and talks about the capacity to persist in the face of disruptions. I think in some cases, when we think of resilience, we think about it in the psychological sense of how we respond to trauma. And as psychologists will tell you, it's hard to go back to the state before a harm or an injury was done. But what we hope is that moving forward, we get some form of function beyond crisis. And so expanded to the ecological realm, to the community realm, to the urban realm, that's sort of our measure of resilience today. And this diagram, which is, I think, overly complicated, but talks about nested cycles of impacts across many trajectories. Just a shout out to Rob. There's a reference to eco district in this particular diagram. I didn't put it there, it was there before. But it shows the complexity of what we're dealing with. But what you don't see in the diagram is anything about people. There's a social component, but people, culture, power, and in this current day and age, the issues of race and racism are absent from this diagram. And we know that they have been revealed. And so part of this uprising that's happening all over the world is the idea that business as usual and the mainstream ways of looking at all of the issues that are impacting our lives have had a glaring blind spot. And so one of the goals of this talk is to issue that. As Rob mentioned, one of my other roles is at the Landscape Architecture Foundation. We're leading a task force this year about the Green New Deal Super Studio, where we have over 1,000 students, 60 different schools, and many professional groups currently working on design and planning strategies that would visualize how the Green New Deal could be functional and operate in regions across the country. But one of the folks that we pay attention to, or one of the groups, the McCarg Center, recently put out this article warning against the repetition of previous eras where environmental benefits and built environmental benefits were distributed unequally. That we know from even the New Deal, which is the reference for the Green New Deal, that was an era in the United States with segregation, where Jim Crow was alive and well. And although there were many New Deal policies that were benefiting many, they were excluding many as well. And so the environmental realm, the built environmental realm, is no exception to that. So as we move forward to think about decarbonizing, to think about how to create environmental justice, new jobs presented by the challenges we face today, we want to be mindful not to repeat those errors and those mistakes. And whenever I do a land acknowledgement, a lot of my indigenous friends kind of roll their eyes because they sometimes see it as empty. But there's been a lot of conversation, at least in our profession, about land rights as a component of resilience and sustainability, and that indigenous people have historically been excluded from these conversations. My colleague Pierre Belanger, for example, coined the phrase "no design on stolen land" to point attention to this glaring issue that whenever we work, particularly in North America, we're not operating with an awareness of treaties, of agreements, of anything dealing with indigenous populations. And so as we start this layering of issues that we could be looking at in the issue of resilience and resistance, it's important to acknowledge that where we are in the United States used to be organized in a very different way based on indigenous people and populations. And over time, those organizations changed. Colonial Expansion, the Manifest Destiny, a lot of the challenges that we see as the past resulted in treaties. And you can see over time how the land where indigenous people actually do have some rights is much, much smaller in footprint than what it was. So that trend of reduction of land rights and land control correlates to, in some ways, lack of presence and lack of power in our conversations today. So reclaiming some of that history of where we work, where we operate, to whom we are obligated is important to the work. And of course, the other great sin of our nation's history, slavery and the enslavement of African Americans, and really the benefits accrued from stolen labor. This is one of the earliest census maps that were created in the then United States, and it's a census showing the enslaved African population across the South. You can see the darker areas are really also a geology map, which shows where there were the richest soils in the South, which were the best places for plantations. And so we understand that there has been, since the beginning of the founding of this country, indigenous land rights, but also profiting from enslaved labor that frames us. And moving forward, we'll get to some examples, but this is in our own backyard where I'm in Raleigh, where we made decisions about where to place cities based on our understanding of environmental systems that impact us today. So in the Southeast, particularly in the Piedmont, the rolling hills, some of the earliest cities were founded on the high points, on ridges, which is where you would want them to be, right? The high ground, prospect, well-drained. But in a situation with unequal rights, African Americans and other communities, these cities were founded during slavery and during Jim Crow, were not allowed to live in those positions. And so their lifestyles were still dependent on activity with those cities. They were forced to occupy the low-lying areas, the valleys. This phenomenon, which has been mapped across the Southeast, is called racialized topography. And it's a result of political systems, racist structures, and puts communities in harm's way. In many southern cities, you'll find that Black and brown communities with low wealth are in low-lying areas that have a higher risk of flood and other ecological challenges and issues. A recent article co-wrote with another colleague who's presented in Eco District's webinars, Julian Edgemon, talks about the other phenomenon, which is land loss. So in the same way that indigenous groups reduced their footprint and their ability to control their land, African Americans as well, up to 98% of land that was owned by African Americans in rural places is no longer owned by African Americans. That represents $1 trillion of wealth that's not available for investment, for development, and for participation in contemporary change. So there are many trends. This was a topic I brought up at the Eco Districts Summit in Pittsburgh, but our good friend Mindy Fuller Thompson wrote a book called Root Shock, where she talks about episodes in American history where policies and development decisions negatively impacted communities and resulted in a pattern that she calls serial displacement. So in periods of time when communities were established and were building wealth and were establishing some boundaries, there were disruptions There's been a lot of discussion most recently about redlining, and everyone's reading The Color of Law, for example, but urban renewal, deindustrialization. So we don't have to go all the way back to colonialism. We don't have to go all the way back to the period of slavery. There are contemporary challenges that are also impacting communities along with the ecological challenges that we all face. And in many ways, it's reflective of the fact that our country is extremely segregated. Many people are surprised to find that many American cities and most of our country is just as segregated as it was in the 1960s. The green dots indicate where there are majority Black populations, and you can see how it's still concentrated, in the old Black Belt. So a lot of this is spatial in addition to ecological and other systems. And it matters now because of communities' varying levels of capacity to handle issues of resilience are tied to wealth and are tied to their connections to the land. This is Raj Chetty's study from 2013, where they looked at upward mobility across the country and tried to estimate which parts of the country you had the best chance to go from the lowest run of poverty to the highest levels of wealth. And ironically, the Southeast, which is in red, are where you have the lowest chances for upward mobility. This is ironic because we know how Atlanta is growing and booming, Charlotte and many other other cities that are representatives of sort of this contemporary boom of urbanism. But in the same place, in the same backyard, it's increasingly hard for Black and brown people of low wealth to advance in that environment. And it results in many issues, but the number one that we talk about is, in terms of lack of wealth, is the differentiation in household wealth based on race. So the blue line represents white, the red and yellow represent Black and Latino, and you can see over 100 to 1. And the basis of some of that wealth differentiation is home ownership, equity built in homes, and other forms of investment that have been negatively impacted by policies over time. And this contributes to people's ability or inability to invest in education and health, passing wealth along to the next generation, and really participating in the environmental changes that we like to see. To bring it back around in our own backyard, this is Eastern North Carolina, and this is from an editorial that was written by colleagues Andy Fox and David Hill regarding rural resiliency issues. And in North Carolina, although the coast gets a lot of the attention in the press in terms of hurricanes and flooding, we also have a huge inland stream system, which you see depicted in the image, all the floodplains in Eastern North Carolina. And this map shows median income. And the closer that people are to many of these waterways and these floodplains, the lower wealth and lower income they are. So there are long land pattern and development decisions that have occurred nationally and regionally that really align the more acute issues of dealing with flooding and dealing with storms versus the more chronic, which are the broader resiliency issues that deal with society, culture, and equity. And of course, all of this is on our radar right now. All of this is happening in real time. We don't have to belabor that, but where I'd like to go to offer a little bit of thinking and then share some cases is really a model that came out of research after Superstorm Sandy hit the Northeast of the United States, where they were trying to understand why some communities seem to be bouncing back faster, why they were more resilient than others. And there were many factors which people who are from the Northeast can get into more detail, but these three issues I thought were interesting that they put on the table in the middle, which is social cohesion. Communities that had the strongest social cohesion bounced back the fastest. And the metrics of that were measures of social mobility, which we talked about in my region where I'm from, we grapple with and we struggle with. But there are other two, social capital, which is important, the ability for work to build trust and increase civic participation, and measures of social exclusion, which I think go right at the issue of race, of culture, of society, and of history, in that we have not had equal access to resources, and we've had different levels of harm due to policies that have excluded large portions of our population. But these three measures offer us another way of thinking about resilience. What if another component of resilience was really focusing on building social cohesion so that communities feel better connected and better able to solve their problems. We've had a lot of people look at this, and this is, again, a great friend, Eco Districts, and one of our great hosts in Pittsburgh, Fred Brown, the CEO of the Forbes Funds. He talks a lot about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the social indicators of health as metrics, alternative metrics that produce a different kind of return on investment. So one of the things that can start to bridge this gap, I think, is rethinking how we think about return on investment. So we're very good at measuring impacts on water quality, air quality, decarbonization. We're very good at development impacts in terms of the portfolios and the pro formas of development. What Fred has put on the table is really looking at the Sustainable Development Goals as another way of measuring return on investment. So what if we put a premium on work and economic growth? What if we measured the impacts on lifelong learning? What if we dealt with the basic needs and the stability of communities and not just the advancement, which is setting a floor of basic access to health, to safety, to welfare? So I think that he's offering, and folks in that regard are offering some tools that can help to bridge this gap through the language you've already established. Another presenter at Eco Districts Summit in Pittsburgh was Dr. Megan Venable Thomas. And so her great work at Enterprise Community Partners, looking at other things contributing to community resilience. We don't often explicitly talk about culture, as a part of it, and the ability to use creativity, arts, humanity, storytelling, narratives as a guide for framing bigger issues. Those are generally more accessible to communities than some of the technical knowledge that you and I and others prepare. But to think about that in the same conversation as we deal with health, as we deal with engagement, as we deal with infrastructure of different types. The Gulf Coast Partnership in New Orleans, speaking of New Orleans earlier, they're getting ready for a hurricane, has developed other indicators that deal with measures of trust and civic participation. So some of their work and recovery since Katrina has been keeping track of a lot of things that we normally don't. So yes, if you're rebuilding an area or making it more resilient, we would pay attention to issues of vacancy and blight and population growth and other things. But they're measuring voting, as they're investing in infrastructure, bricks and mortar. They're also thinking about how does the improvements in the community that are making it more resilient also translate in more agency, like more belief that you can influence the process. How does it impact policing, right? Does it change that relationship from overly aggressive and punitive policing that's a part of the new Jim Crow to ones that build better partnerships with law enforcement and with safety? And what they found is that they've been able to build these metrics that provide additional data points and have not displaced anyone. So when we were there a couple of years ago, that's when I was there with the AIA Design Justice Summit, touring the facilities and talking with all the folks. That was probably the most shocking statistic, was that they were able to achieve an incredible amount of work without being directly responsible for displacement of any residents that were there before. So that combination is unique and is interesting. So that provides, some of the range of ways that people are looking at these issues around. And for the remainder of the presentation, the time I have, I'd like to share a few cases from where we're working on these issues in our own backyard. So at NC State, Andy Fox and David Hill direct the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab, which we collaborate with often. And one of the more recent works was the Lumberton Community Floodprint, and this idea of flood printing as a process, which is to say, in our area, we are faced with a lot of small, under-resourced communities in rural areas that are dealing with tremendous impacts from increased flooding, hurricane hits, a lot of these sort of issues that are becoming more chronic. And at the same time, there are underlying social equity and racial justice issues. And so how do we start to align those so that when we deploy resources, eventually that we're actually doing more than just protecting people from flood? And what that did was that this particular process really went right at social vulnerability and testing some of these uh, tools for really reading communities to see which ones were really feeling disproportionate impact. It seems kind of obvious, and I think if you come from a big city with lots of resources, this might be a part of your standard business model, but you'd be amazed at how little attention to this is given to rural areas, small areas, and low resource areas. And so this mapping was important for people to understand that increased flood risk meant compounding on the day-to-day risks of everyday people, Black and brown and low wealth. And part of that was also about resources, in that for people who are familiar with the FEMA process of disaster recovery, there's sort of these shocks to the system where immediately following a disaster, there's a flood of resources and people and technical expertise. And in some communities' cases, it outstrips their ability to absorb all of those resources and effectively use them, because they've been so low resource and understaffed for so long. And so you find these moments where there's an abundance and then there's sort of a drought, and in those droughts, it kind of goes back to business as usual. And some of these smaller communities are left holding the bag. The reason why I'm talking about this in relation to this slide is that it talks about the expenditures and the revenues allocated, particularly to open space in the town of Lumberton, and shows a huge disparity in how much they can afford to spend on things outside of disaster funding versus then. And that, believe it or not, was a huge policy and structural barrier to continued progress to protect that community from flooding. So sometimes it's just revealing some of these inconsistencies so that communities can better align their resources and be more strategic. And then resolving into design strategies and planning strategies that amplify social cultural issues as well as promote resilience, ecological resilience. And in this case, it was an old meatpacking plant that had community history and legacy that is being planned now as an education center and really an observatory and a scientific place for people to study the Tar River, to get more connected to it, and as a small example, a pilot of what could occur all along the Tar River's length for community benefit. Home Place was another effort that we all worked on in the past. This is in the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew, which unbelievably is almost 4 years ago. And sadly, the 6 communities that are featured here in Eastern North Carolina are still in recovery from Matthew, even though we've had at least 2 hurricanes since then. So that shows you in some ways the impact of the time that required for resources and capacity. But this process emerged because we thought that, again, responding to these episodic moments right after crisis where attention is focused and then it goes away, the need for tools for communities to continue that conversation in the absence of designers, of technical experts, peer-to-peer, community to community, so that everyone is more aware of the issues and the opportunities presented. Home Place was designed as sort of a community conversation guide. There were 6 pilot communities where this was tried. There are paper publications, there's an online presence, it's web friendly. And the real mission is to provide in the simplest terms as possible what the issues are in terms of resiliency and risk and opportunity for communities. So it's gonna come as a shock to a lot of people, but most people don't know what a floodplain is. They got no idea. When you say 100-year flood, 500-year flood, 100-year hurricane, 500-year storm, they got no idea. So usually it's in the aftermath of that, when you're facing trauma, when you're forced to kind of educate yourself on these broader issues. So we decided to pull that apart and say, hey, let's help communities understand what these terms mean, where these places are in their actual communities, how that relates to some of their decision-making. If they are in line to get resources to help recover, rebuild, or build more resiliently, what are the options? Why do they matter? Why would you relocate, for example? Or why would you elevate in place? Why would you do these other options? Again, most people are not really faced with those decisions until they're at the crisis point, but to have those conversations in advance not only helps communities be better educated, but in some cases helps them attract other resources that allow them more flexibility to really express what they want to do culturally. in the case of newer residents, they may not even know that there's a history of storms or hurricanes, or there's a pattern of this. And so just visualizing, when particular events occurred, what the impacts of those events were, helps people, particularly decision makers, understand the frequency of it. So this chart at the bottom is small, hard to read, but it increases. So as you go from left to right, there are more instances of major hurricanes and floods, which aligns with what we know about climate change. And in the end of the day, most people are most concerned about the experience of their place, and there are elements of character and quality that they associate with their home places. Architectural quality, street quality, public space quality. And so illustrating for them what the implications of building in a more resilient way could mean, that it doesn't necessarily mean sacrificing your sense of character or the sense of community that you like. It means that we update and we complement, but we pay attention to how new things fit in with old. I mentioned Princeville at the beginning of the talk. It's a town that we spent a lot of time in, particularly since Hurricane Matthew. For people who don't know, it's the first free chartered town founded by Black folks and African Americans in the country. It was founded as Freedom Hill in 1865 on the banks of the Tar River. And unfortunately, representative of this racialized topography idea, it was built in the low-lying areas, literally in the swamp. It was renamed Princeville after Turner Prince, a prominent resident, carpenter and lumber businessman who really invested in the town, and from there it went on. And this image comes from the Cultural Landscape Foundation. They had a program called Grounds for Democracy, where they were highlighting significant historical landscapes around the country. And so it talks to some of these issues. Because of the recurring floods in Princeville, many of the historic structures that you see pictured here are no longer there. And so when you go there today, there's not much evidence from the time of its founding of its significance, but the residents of it and a lot of the folks who still live there and are still focused on rebuilding, looking for new strategies, are really the strength in the stories. And to bring to the students that idea, we really started with a 5-day workshop where we just wanted to share as much information as possible about why the town floods, what the opportunities were there, and also many people who've done community workshops before, that in some cases they attract sort of the usual set of players, but we were really pleasantly surprised that in addition to the folks that you would normally see, this process uncovered new groups, younger groups with different kinds of energy. The two ladies in the foreground are the founders of freedom.org, which has carried forward the mission of Princeville to the next generation of residents. Which brings me to this picture, which is the image from the start of the slides. We were working with a youth group in the Triangle region where I'm at in Raleigh, called Enviro Kids, which is about exposing middle school and high school kids to environmental career pathways, and decided off of the heels of that Princeville workshop to host sort of a walking tour of Princeville, because most of them were an hour away and had never heard of the place and didn't know its history or its benefits. So we hired Freedom.org, paid everyone a living wage to design this tour, hosted the tour and walked it. And this was one of the first stops. They're looking at an area called Shiloh Landing, which is on the Tar River. It's the last navigable by large boat location of the Tar River coming down from Virginia. And it's where enslaved Africans were brought south from Virginia at this spot, and then walked several miles to the old slave market in Tarboro, which was the town center at the time. And so starting there with that story of how the river and the people and the culture kind of converged really got their attention. And, after that tour, we really spent a lot of time talking about, from the students' perspectives, what they saw, what they experienced, things that they were interested in. And this became a pathway to introduce them to our range of careers in environmental professions. So we hosted them at the college. We introduced them to architecture and landscape architecture and planning. We introduced them to tools to visualize some of their ideas, including learning SketchUp, which was a big hit, free online 3D modeling platform, and asked them, to think about what they'd like to see in Princeville now that they know the cultural stories. So this actually became a portal to passing information along to the next generation. This was one of the places that was very popular on the walking tour. It's the old Museum and Welcome Center, which is a repurposed Rosenwald School, which is a conversation for another time. But they were very disappointed that the exhibits, the state of the building because of this flood damage, really did not do justice to the town. The exhibits were gone. There was really nothing there. And that sort of combination of their creativity and that prompt led to a really interesting pivot in the college. So coming off of that, we had a conversation after that tour, a number of us in the college, and said, well, we just brought a bunch of kids to Princeville, and they were very excited about learning the history, but they were very disappointed that there wasn't a place to really talk about it and share it and expose it. And it seemed to work out with the timing of a design build architecture studio that had since lost an actual project that it had intended to do, but then also came into contact with a funder who was willing to fund a different project, and they were open in terms of what that was. And so what we talked about was the idea of a temporary facility, a mobile museum, as a way to feature and showcase community history until the renovation and regeneration of the actual museum was put in place. And so what you see before you is what was designed and built in 8 weeks by architecture students. It's currently in the town of Princeville. It's being used for exhibit space and for ways of telling community history. It has the capacity to hook up to the back of a truck, and you could take it to Washington, D.C. and advocacy. You could take it to historically Black colleges and universities, or anywhere where there might be an audience for this particular work. And so this innovation actually came out of a real need in that particular place and has built momentum. Unfortunately, this event did not occur due to COVID, but for the first time, it kind of galvanized the community and got them focused on a homecoming, an actual festival that brought back together people who were displaced due to Hurricane Matthew to celebrate the history of the town, bringing in regional Black farmers to provide produce and food, local musicians to provide music. And so we really look forward to the post-COVID era when we can build on this next momentous step. We're going to close this out probably with this one, so there's enough time for questions. I'm going to leave out a few of the last examples just in the interest of time. But I did want to talk about something that was connected to the Princeville workshop, which was getting contacted by the AIA, their RUDAT process, Regional Urban Design Assistance Team, which is over 50 years old, which is pro bono services by teams of technical experts that work with communities when they're invited in to work with issues. And so the Lower Ninth Ward had put in an application, but for various reasons had not moved forward. But on the heels of the Princeville workshop, which surfaced a number of issues and talked about a lot of social resilience issues, there was interest in pursuing that further with the Lower Ninth Ward. And the Lower Ninth Ward, as we all know, post-Katrina, is probably the most studied, most planned spot of ground in North America. And the community itself felt the burden of that in terms of not wanting to feel like an experiment that really helped others profit and helped them prosper and left them with nothing that was really useful. And that was a real issue in terms of agreeing to even work on it, is because I didn't want to personally contribute to that pattern either. And for people who don't know about the Lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, it was one of the last parts of the city of New Orleans that was developed, was sugar plantations and a lot of areas. It's in low-lying area. There's some parts of the Lower Ninth Ward that are below sea level. It's one of the few communities that's almost surrounded by water on 3 sides between the Industrial Canal, Bayou Bienvenue, and then the Mississippi River, and was the place where floodwaters really overwhelmed the levee and flooded the city. So there's a lot of legacy and a lot of stories there. And one of them that really got the community upset was what's now known as the Green Dot Plan, but immediately following Katrina, where that green dot in East 8 is located on the lower right of that diagram, is half of the lower Ninth Ward, which was the reasonable decision by others, was that you don't rebuild because it's low lying and there are a lot of issues. It reverts to environmental spaces converted to park space. I think there was even a golf course proposed there. And so a lot of community folks were still very upset about that. And what we learned when we arrived was that they were most concerned about breathing life into the places that were important to them. And just as a point of information, just south in Holy Cross, that area is almost completely rebuilt and reestablished. And St. Bernard's Parish, which is immediately to the right of the diagram just outside of New Orleans city limits, is completely rebuilt in the exact same elevations and in the exact same threat levels and risks. And so they really felt like they were being excluded from opportunity. Just a few of the folks that were important: Fats Domino, of course, resident, Lower Ninth Ward; Ron Lewis, who's pictured there, who founded the House of Dance and Feathers, who was instrumental in encouraging residents of the Lower Ninth Ward to return after Katrina because of his significant respect and really admiration, particularly with the Mardi Gras Indian groups. He recently passed away, so God bless the dead. And local business owners, so Cafe Dauphine, where we ate almost every day, were evidence of people's interests. And new schools, new pavilions that really for the first time took advantage of Bienvenue as that is slowly reclaiming itself and restoring as an amenity, as an attraction. Guerrilla gardens, people adaptive reusing vacant lots for food production and for job and skills training. So there was a lot of strength there. And probably the number one issue was new mayor, new leadership. The mayor was actually a community advocate for Broadmoor, who had gone through a similar process post-Katrina, but at the neighborhood scale. But Mayor Cantrell then, with that knowledge and that interest, wanted to upscale it and deal with larger portions of the city. So a lot of community engagement, a lot of work that you all are familiar with. But instead of really beautiful urban design renderings and drawings and models and things that we typically do, we talk more about process and we talk more about engagement. And so this idea of a Lower Ninth Ward development partnership that would set the table and be a place for all the partners to have voice, to have influence, to have conversations, leveraging current momentum. So the lady to the right with the flowers in the picture is Miss Leona Tate, who was one of the McDonough Three, who on the same day that Ruby Bridges integrated New Orleans schools in another part of the city, was also one of the first Black ladies to integrate, at that time, an all-white school in the neighborhood, and who had recently purchased that school that she'd integrated and developed a partnership with the National Park Service to turn it into a civil rights history museum, as well as senior housing. And so the ability to kind of identify that, highlight that, and find mechanisms to leverage that matter. With regards to ecology, of course, the 500-year or 1,000-year event that was Katrina, there's almost no protection for that, but it turns out that the more common flooding that occurred in the Lower Ninth Ward was in the 10-year range. And it turns out that the green dot was not required in order to do that, that you could have much smaller footprint and much more strategic uses of green streets, of rain gardens, of other elements, particularly to the northern edge of the Lower Ninth Ward, that could actually provide green infrastructure, benefits, fuel jobs, have resources that were not deployed post-Katrina directed towards them to make them all more substantial. And other decision-making tools. So really prompting the community to say, hey, when something comes before you in terms of redevelopment or investment, how does it increase your collective power? How does it build collective resources? How does it build collective capacity? And how does it grow collective systems? Those are the kinds of questions that communities benefit from when they're trying to decide how to operate. So I'll close with this slide in the interest of time. I'll come back to this article. The next frontier, I think, is really this issue of land rights and ownership and the ability to build wealth and resources from the land. And maybe that's a topic for another time. But with that, happy to answer any questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Kofi. Many questions coming off the Q&A. So folks, if you're interested, please put your questions on there. I want to start with a broader sort of setting the table. Kofi, you mentioned, and it's clear in your work as you opened, you talked about the need for our profession to be more focused on people and the resilience of people, and not as so focused on the design solutions. I think that is extremely clear as you talked about your work and really both engaging many stakeholders and sort of providing a broader context of the work, some of it very, that's historically invisible or misunderstood. There's some questions about your engagement strategies. Can you talk about how you've elevated the conversations, but beyond just engagement, but towards the solutions that you call out in the Ninth Ward, the idea of governance and the idea of taking those strategies and being able to sort of actualize them. There's some questions around the tactics. How did you do it? Were there stipends involved? Were there childcare? So some of the X's and O's of engagement. And then a sort of a corollary question about, in the age of COVID, how are you sort of moving forward with some of this work, given obviously the limitations that we're all facing? So talk a bit about, putting people at the center of this work and how it's leading to not just solutions or design ideas, but actual implementation.
Those are great questions. I'll talk just generally about a number of efforts, and then if people want more detail about a specific one, I can talk about it. One is being in the academic space gives us a bit more flexibility, and we're at a land-grant institution. So, our mission is to bring best practices to, the people. And so, part of that imperative is that we don't have the same sort of profit model as, say, a firm or some other entity. And so if we can make a research or an educational case for it and align it with best practices, then that gives us a lot of latitude. And so I just want to start there, because some of these are not transferable to, say, if you're working at a firm or another entity. But, we've been able to attract grants and funding, particularly in partnership with public health entities, where that's more the norm, which is if you're going to engage a community, then you're going to compensate people for their time. So, and you're going to be, cognizant of their whole life. So, there's recent work in Durham where we teamed with community members, and we were able to pay people who worked at a certain level a living wage. And so in the long term, the value of what we're doing is strategy, vision, big changes. But in the short term, just that basic trust building, respect level of like, hey, we're all contributing our time. Why should I be compensated and you not, if we're, in this together? And so, it's a small gesture, but it's helpful. Yes, on childcare for sure. In the case of the Lower Ninth Ward, we worked with a number of local ministers and churches who were able to negotiate that and develop that. But, to speak to the Lower Ninth Ward in terms of the direction that we went, I think that it was a timing thing. With all community engagement, I would say, don't go where you're not invited. And when you're invited, work in a collaborative manner to be clear about everyone's expectations before you begin. So that everyone understands around the table, that not only what the outcome will be, but what everyone needs. It's usually a very interesting conversation. Me coming as an academic, I have different needs than, say, a resident or a professional or someone else. And so being clear about that in the beginning helps people sort of navigate what their expectations are. And lastly, I would say we were trying to take advantage of a political moment. We had the benefit of, at that time, a new Councilwoman Wynn, and a new mayor, Mayor Cantrell, who both not only lived through Katrina, but lived through at a smaller scale, a neighborhood scale, the kinds of work with designers and planners that was required in the case of Broadmoor to bring it to another place. And so we saw that as a window, and that's what provided sort of that opportunity.
Great, thank you. Some questions coming at us around policy, and I'm not sure how much work you've done in policy, but in particular the issue of gentrification and the sort of the issues of gentrification and displacement and how they are both different but intersect. can you talk a bit about your work and how you've worked to mitigate issues of displacement um, or or gentrification? So how investments, and I imagine New Orleans is a place to point on that as well, where the investment obviously leads to a lot of consequences associated with displacement. So can you talk a little bit about your work in that, and any policy prescriptions you've come across to share with folks to mitigate?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I tend to uncouple them a little bit. If I think gentrification has gotten to become a broad term that's inclusive of displacement, but displacement's a little bit different. There are risk factors for displacement. So, for example, high renter populations that are spending more than 30% of their average annual median income in that area on housing, seniors on fixed income, families that that don't have resources, and quite frankly, race. Because I think in American cities, we went through an era in the 20th century where we disinvested in cities, where we really invested in suburbs and other areas that were outside of the city center, and city centers became sort of the places Black and brown communities of low wealth. And so in that sense, the reinvestment in the city and development is a good thing. However, what's not good is there hasn't been a commensurate amount of investment in the human capital side so that residents can participate in that change. And so when you have folks who are underemployed, not able to generate wealth and income, who don't own their land and their property, they're relying on public policy to sort of protect them. And it's fighting in the face of a lot of trends. So the short answer, I would say, is first of all, is awareness, is that there are indicators that can let you know areas that are most vulnerable, right? And so becoming educated on what those factors are in your own community counts. The second one is catalytic projects that can set a precedent in terms of the time horizon, which is to say, an example that I'm sure people on this call know, 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C., the LISC-led sort of community equitable development plan that came out of that, which I've learned since was the equitable development plan that was planned for the Atlanta Beltline, but was never implemented. But that idea is it's a 10-year horizon, which is 10 years before the stain opens. They acknowledged it was going to have this incredible impact on real estate markets. They said, yes, we know it is. What can we do to prepare? So they focused on home ownership, on job and skills training, on entrepreneurship, on arts and culture, right? And what's interesting is they didn't lead with arts and culture. That was added later, but that was an attempt to find threads and ways for existing residents to latch on and put a hold on. So people are studying it now. Like ULI is doing a longitudinal study of the impacts, but we're looking at it now from the standpoint of, does time matter? Like, does acknowledging that this is coming, that this change is coming, and preparation, not a guarantee that people can stay in place, but preparation. The other one, which is where I ended the talk and might be a future conversation, is increasing evidence about community land trusts, about co-ops and cooperative land ownership, because the rules of this game are completely different when you have land control. When you're just relying on policy on land you don't own, it's just really limited. But the more that you can get into ownership and control and really focusing on the land as a source of wealth, the stronger position that you're in.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the final question we'll end with, and there's a lot of questions here. We will make sure we'll send some of these to you, Kofi, and if you've got time to sort of answer them, we'll put them in our webinar notes. This webinar is being recorded, obviously, and will be made available to all attendees and those who registered. Question about your work with FEMA and just federal policy. You mentioned that many of these communities, and we're going to go through the same experience here in Oregon and the West Coast after the fires, is the amount of intense federal emergency money that's going to sort of flow into these communities. What have you learned or experienced, and what advice would you give FEMA and the federal government to either invest differently, reset policies so that emergency management and recovery is done in a way that follows some of the work that you've been pioneering?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, to reiterate, I think it's a time thing in that communities that have a lot of resources, you know, a lot of technical resources, a lot of development, capital, a lot of sort of things at their disposal, you know, they're probably already thinking ahead, like, you know, we need a disaster recovery plan. We need to get the best information out there. We need to disseminate it. We need to train our staff so that they're prepared for it. You know, there's sort of these capacities that wealthier and larger communities have. And so really there's a divide between them and lower resource communities who say, for example, don't have access to the latest information, don't have development pressure or interest, maybe going the other way. They may be legacy cities where they're just trying to hold on to populations, or they're just really small, you know, and that's a case of a lot of rural communities. And so this is just my perspective, but my experience with it is that the current rules serve well-resourced folks extremely well. And there's a gap. The gap are folks who don't have as many resources. And so what do you do about it? One thing I think is not just relying on FEMA for resources and expertise, and then thinking about resources that are more flexible and more amenable to working with the timelines of communities in need, because I don't think it can be one size fits all. So that means, you know, in our case, university partnerships, philanthropies, other entities, and in smaller communities, convincing sort of collaborations and partnerships at the regional scale, because a lot of these ecological and environmental issues are not specific to a town. You know, there's watersheds, there's other units that are more aligned with environmental units. We don't have the ability right now to really serve communities tied together in those particular units. So there's a couple of things that would be different, but the short version would be we have a chronic need to provide expertise and resources and support to low resource communities in between the shocks to the system that are the crises like fires or hurricanes or other things.
Great, thank you, Kofi, for those final thoughts. There's so much here, many questions we haven't been able to get to. I want to just in the last couple of minutes turn our attention just to give our listeners some resources. First, to thank the Kresge Foundation. And can you see, just remind, can you see which slide deck can you see, by the way? Can you see the full screen on this, Kofi?
Mm-hmm. I can see it.
Oh, you can. Okay, great. I want to thank our sponsors of the webinar series, GBB Foundation, Kresge Foundation, for making this available and allowing us to bring Kofi. I also want to point out, for those of you who aren't as familiar with our work is really centered on the kind of work that Kofi calls out, which is community-driven, equitable, and sustainable development. And we've developed a very sort of user-friendly, what we call ecodistricts protocol, to help guide projects. It's been downloaded thousands of times around the world, but we encourage you, it's a free resource to get your hands on that. It really speaks to the data-driven and community-led and collaborative governance models that Kofi is pointing to in his work, recognizing ultimately we need more and more of these projects to be elevated. We need our profession, the urban planning, design, community development, and real estate professions to really embrace a much more inclusive, much more intersectional approach to our community development work. And then we have our certification program. For those who are wanting to use the protocol, you can pursue certification, and it's really a community of practice that we're building in leadership with resources. And I can point, and we can point you to some of our first certified projects actually in Pittsburgh. They've got terrific resources on their collaborative governance, on their performance road mapping, and on their explicit actions associated with equity, resilience, and climate protection, are three imperatives for the work. So want to ensure that you know about that. And we want you to encourage you to become an accredited professional in our Ecodistricts program as a way to help expand knowledge and build awareness of this kind of work that Kofi is really helping to lead. There's so many resources. I think one of the great moments we're having professionally is the amount of resources, particularly around race justice and the sort of impact of race and how it's playing or has historically impacted, as that timeline that Kofi showed, on the development of our communities. And it's up to us, particularly as white professionals, to study the history and to become very aware of how our policies and our structural systems need to be adjusted. So we encourage people to become an AP. There's many of us around the country and around the world, which is exciting. So it's our small contribution to this movement. And we really encourage you to participate. So with that, we're really thankful again to have Kofi with us. This is being recorded, has been recorded, and will be made available to you all. We look forward to seeing you later this year. We have 2 more webinars scheduled. Kofi mentioned Megan Venable Thomas of Enterprise and their cultural resilience work. We're going to be hearing from both from the Enterprise team on that work coming up this fall. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again, Kofi. I know you have to get off to get your kids. It's the world we live in. So thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.